From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This is not a privatization of VA. This is not diluting the impact of VA. Every day I'm in this job, I am more and more convinced that veterans and America need a strong VA. It's essential for national security. It's essential to honor our commitment.
Months after Veterans Affairs Secretary Dr. David Shulkin comes out against privatizing the VA, President Trump fires him. Will his firing help the Koch brothers fulfill their dream of privatizing health care for veterans? The $200 billion agency is the second largest in the government. We'll speak to longtime healthcare journalist Suzanne Gordon. Then, we look at the stunning remarks made by former Republican presidential candidate Rick Santorum about the Parkland, Florida students who organized the March for Our Lives.
How about kids, instead of looking to someone else to solve their problem, do something about maybe taking CPR classes?
We'll speak with Dr. Eugene Gu about Santorum's comments, as well as why he's suing President Trump for blocking him on Twitter. Then the funeral for the groundbreaking physicist Stephen Hawking will be held on Saturday.
We are close to the tipping point where global warming becomes irreversible. Trump's action could push the Earth over the brink to become like Venus, with a temperature of 250 degrees and raining sulfuric acid.
We'll speak with Kitty Ferguson, author of 2 biographies on Stephen Hawking. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration's poised to radically weaken fuel efficiency and emission standards in U.S. automobiles in the latest blow to efforts to curb catastrophic climate change. The planned changes by Environmental Protection Agency head Scott Pruitt would roll back Obama-era rules meant to limit greenhouse gas emissions from tailpipes, including a requirement that U.S. cars average more than 50 miles per gallon by 2025. Many U.S. states, led by California, have promised to challenge the rollback. The lowered emission standards come as climate scientists have accused the EPA of making misleading statements about global warming. A leaked internal EPA email sent to communications staff by a senior official provides talking points to others at the agency, including the line, quote, "While there has been extensive research and a host of published reports on climate change, clear gaps remain, including our understanding of the role of human activity and what we can do about it," unquote. In fact, some 97% of scientists who have written articles for peer-reviewed journals have concluded climate change is real, caused by human activity, and is already causing devastating problems. The leaked emails come as the Washington Post reports EPA Chief Scott Pruitt paid just $50 a night to live in a Capitol Hill condo linked to a prominent Washington lobbyist whose firm represents a roster of fossil fuel companies. Meanwhile, Rhode Island Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse wrote a letter to the EPA's Inspector General that Pruitt used his security detail in non-official trips to Disneyland, a football game at the Rose Bowl, and a University of Kentucky basketball game. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will meet his South Korean counterpart, President Moon Jae-in, in a face-to-face gathering next month at the so-called Truce Village in the demilitarized zone separating the two Koreas. Thursday's announcement of the planned summit, which comes amidst a thaw in tensions on the peninsula, was welcomed Thursday by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
I am very encouraged by the recent developments, very encouraged by the announcement of the Inter-Korean Summit. And I believe that in this world where, unfortunately, so many problems seem not to have a solution, I think there is here an opportunity for a peaceful solution to something that a few months ago was outed us as the biggest danger we were facing.
Russia on Thursday ordered the U.S. to close its embassy in St. Petersburg and said it would expel 60 U.S. diplomats in the latest escalation of tensions over Russia's alleged poisoning of Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, Britain, earlier this month. Russia denies carrying out the nerve agent poisoning. President Trump, who defied the advice of his aides and congratulated Russian President Vladimir Putin on his recent re-election, has made no mention of the poisoning. And on Thursday, Trump did not mention the expulsion of U.S. diplomats during a campaign rally in Ohio. In the Gaza Strip, a farmer was killed and a second man wounded overnight after an Israeli tank opened fire near the town of Khan Yunis. The pair had reportedly wandered near the wall separating the besieged Palestinian territory from Israel. The death came as Gaza residents built a tent city near the wall as part of a planned 6-week-long protest kicking off today, which is known as Land Day. The annual event marks the anniversary of the 1976 killing of 6 Palestinians protesting the Israeli confiscation of Arab land. In Egypt, former military general Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has been declared the winner in a re-election campaign blasted by critics as a farce. Initial returns show Sisi claimed 92% of the vote, with a turnout of just over 40% of eligible voters. All but one of Sisi's challengers were barred from running, leading to wide-scale voter ambivalence toward this week's election. This is Yasmin Madbouli, who declined to cast a ballot.
Honestly, I won't vote. I see many others already voting, and the result has already been known from the first day. What difference will my vote make? My parents voted, and they are telling me that I must, but I won't go.
President Donald Trump has embraced President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as an ally, even as he's continued a wide-ranging crackdown against human rights activists across Egypt, with reports of torture, forced disappearances, mass arrests, and extrajudicial killings. The Pentagon said today 2 members of the U.S.-led coalition fighting in Syria were killed and another 5 wounded after they set off an improvised explosive device. A spokesperson declined to identify the nationalities of the dead and wounded. The report came a day after President Trump told a campaign rally in Ohio the U.S. is preparing to pull out of Syria.
We're knocking the hell out of ISIS. We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now. Very soon we're coming out. We're going to have 100% of the caliphate, as they call it, sometimes referred to as land. We're taking it all back quickly. But we're going to be coming out of there real soon. Going to get back to our country, where we belong, where we want to be.
Earlier this month, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson announced U.S. troops will remain indefinitely in Syria. Trump's comments Thursday appeared to catch administration officials by surprise. This is State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert being questioned Thursday by reporter Matt Lee of the Associated Press.
So you're not aware of any policy determination to pull the U.S. out of Syria?
I am not, no.
Okay, no. So the president is just speaking off the cuff and making
I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to refer you back to the White House.
In Washington, D.C., President Trump's incoming National Security Advisor John Bolton met at the Pentagon Thursday with Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. It was the first time the pair have met face-to-face. As they walked past reporters, Mattis was overheard joking, quote, "It's good to finally meet you since I've heard that you're actually the devil incarnate."
Thanks for coming, and it's good to finally meet you. Since I've heard that you're actually devil incarnate. I wanted to meet you.
John Bolton is known for his ultra-hawkish views and has openly backed war against both Iran and North Korea, calling for a preemptive strike. He was a prominent supporter of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The Trump administration's ended a policy exempting pregnant women from being jailed by Immigrant and Customs Enforcement. ICE says its new policy will see agents decide whether to release pregnant women on a case-by-case basis, with most women in their 3rd trimester released. In a statement, the American Civil Liberties Union said ICE needs more, not less, transparency and accountability, adding, quote, "This new policy further exposes the cruelty of Trump's detention and deportation force by endangering the lives of pregnant immigrant women," unquote. Advocates say many women enter the U.S. seeking to escape domestic violence, with many reporting they became pregnant after surviving rape and sexual assault. Meanwhile, the head of North Carolina's state prisons has ordered an end to a policy allowing pregnant women prisoners to be shackled while in labor. At least 8 U.S. states have no laws preventing the practice, while many other states have loopholes that allow it. In 2010, the American Medical Association condemned the practice, writing, quote, "The use of shackles to restrain a pregnant woman during the birthing process is a barbaric practice that needlessly inflicts excruciating pain and humiliation." Fox News host Laura Ingraham apologized Thursday for mocking high school student David Hogg, who survived last month's school shooting in Parkland, Florida, which left 17 people dead. On Wednesday, Ingraham tweeted, quote, "David Hogg rejected by 4 colleges to which he applied and whines about it." Her comment prompted Haag to call on his more than 600,000 Twitter followers to boycott advertisers who sponsor Ingram's show. So far, at least 4 companies, TripAdvisor, Nestle, Wayfair, and Nutrish, have ended their sponsorship of Ingram's program. In Massachusetts, an outspoken prisoner at the state's largest prison has gone on hunger strike after he was placed in solitary confinement for attempting to distribute clean water to other prisoners. Waylon Coleman, a prisoner at the MCI Norfolk prison, was placed in solitary after guards discovered 15 cases of bottled water in his cell. Coleman had collected the water from the prison canteen after a group called the Deeper Than Water Coalition raised funds to distribute it to prisoners who are otherwise forced to drink foul-tasting tea-colored water full of sediment from the prison's aging plumbing. Coleman's supporters say he's stopped eating food in protest of his treatment as he enters his 10th day in a solitary confinement cell. In Sacramento, California, hundreds of mourners gathered Thursday for the funeral of Stephon Clark, an unarmed African-American man who was shot by police officers 20 times in his grandmother's backyard. Among those eulogizing Clark was the Reverend Al Sharpton.
Yesterday, the president's press secretary said this is a local matter. No, this is not a local matter. They've been killing young black men all over the country. And we are here to say that we're going to stand with Stephon Clark and the leaders of his family. We're putting aside our differences. It's time for preachers to come out the pulpit. It's time for politicians to come out the office. It's time for us to go down and stop this madness.
In Texas, a judge sentenced a woman from the Dallas-Fort Worth area to 5 years in prison Wednesday on charges of illegally voting after she cast a ballot in the 2016 presidential election. Crystal Mason, who's African-American, said she cast a provisional ballot in good faith after she arrived at her usual polling place and was told her name was not on the rolls. Mason was on supervised release from a 2011 felony fraud conviction at the time, making her ineligible to vote under Texas state law. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison by State District Judge Ruben Gonzalez after she waived her right to a jury trial. According to the Sentencing Project, almost 500,000 Texans were disenfranchised in 2016 due to felony convictions. In Oklahoma, public school teachers say they're maintaining plans to strike a day after Governor Mary Fallin signed a bill bringing them a $6,100 pay raise and other benefits. The Oklahoma Education Association says the measure is welcome but does not go far enough to improve the lives of its nearly 40,000 members. A recent report by the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows teachers in Oklahoma have the lowest average wages of any U.S. state. And in New York City, supporters of Aura Fernandez, a Guatemalan woman who's taken sanctuary in a Manhattan Unitarian church, gathered outside Trump International Hotel and Tower Thursday for a Jericho walk, blasting the administration over its crackdown on immigrants and calling an end to ICE's bid to deport Hernandez. She's the mother of 2 U.S.-born children, 10-year-old Victor Daniel and 14-month-old Camila Guadalupe. Aura Hernandez entered sanctuary a few weeks ago to keep her family united as she continues to fight for her immigration case. She says in 2005, when she first entered the United States, she was sexually abused while detained by the Border Patrol in Texas. Yesterday, I spoke with Hernandez at the Fourth Universalist Society of New York, where she's taken sanctuary. What did it mean to have your feet washed by the clergy?
To feel like there are people that see us as important, because we are fighting for peace within families.
To see our extended interview with Aura Hernandez as she holds her sleeping baby in her arms in sanctuary at the Fourth Universalist Society in New York on the Upper West Side, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show looking at the turmoil in the Department of Veterans Affairs. On Wednesday, President Trump fired Secretary of Veterans Affairs David Shulkin and said he'd replace him with White House physician Dr. Ronny Jackson, a Rear Admiral in the Navy. Dr. Jackson has no experience running a large agency. The Department of Veterans Affairs is the federal government's second largest agency, with 360,000 employees. Shulkin had been facing criticism for various ethics violations, including using taxpayer money to pay for his wife's airfare during a trip to Europe last summer. But Shulkin says he's actually been ousted because of his opposition to privatizing the VA, which runs 1,700 hospitals and clinics. In an op-ed for the New York Times, Dr. Shulkin wrote, "They saw me as an obstacle to privatization who had to be removed. That is because I am convinced that privatization is a political issue aimed at rewarding select people and companies with profits, even if it undermines care for veterans," unquote. The push to privatize the VA has been led by a group called Concerned Veterans for America, which is funded by the billionaire conservative Koch brothers. But other veterans groups, including the Veterans of Foreign Wars and the American Legion, have opposed the privatization plans. On Sunday, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont tweeted, "The struggle at the VA is about Trump's desire to privatize the VA and his belief that Shulkin is not moving fast enough in that direction. The Senate Veterans Committee, on which I serve, must stand with the veterans of our country and oppose all efforts to privatize the VA," Senator Sanders tweeted. We're joined now by Suzanne Gordon, an award-winning healthcare journalist. Her recent piece for the American Prospect is headlined, "Studies Show Private Sector Providers Are Not Ready to Care for Veterans." Gordon is the author of The Battle for Veterans Healthcare, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Policymaking and Patient Care. Her forthcoming book, Wounds of War, Veterans Healthcare in the Era of Privatization. Well, this story is certainly up your alley, Suzanne Gordon. Can you start off by responding to the news that President Trump fired Dr. David Shulkin? Of course, he actually didn't fire him himself. He spoke to Shulkin, had an extended conversation with Shulkin on Wednesday, according to Dr. Shulkin. He didn't know he was being fired. And then hours later, he tweeted that Dr. Shulkin was fired. Suzanne Gordon, your response.
Well, that's par for the course for Donald Trump. He tweets that you're fired. He doesn't do it in person. I think the issue here really, Dr. Shulkin sadly gave some ammunition to those who wanted to get rid of him because they felt that he wasn't privatizing the Veterans Health Administration, which is really what this is all about. It's the second largest agency. The VA is the second largest agency in the United States, and it runs the largest healthcare system in the United States, which is the Veterans Health Administration, which serves the needs of 9 million of America's 22 million veterans. And there's been a move since 2014, mostly promoted by the conservative Koch brothers, to use the VA to discredit government and to try to privatize the VA and send more and more veterans to private sector doctors and hospitals. And Secretary Shulkin wasn't doing this quickly enough. He was doing it partially, but he wasn't doing it quickly enough. And his ringing defense of the VA in the New York Times is very important for people to read. I'm sad that he didn't articulate that kind of defense earlier in the many hearings that he was in and in other public statements, but the fact that he's doing it now is really to be commended. And there is a huge threat to privatize the VA by people like the Koch brothers, by the infamous hedge fund insider trader Stephen Cohen, who's trying to set up an alternative mental health system to compete with the VA. This is a very serious moment for the VA.
I wanted to turn to David Shulkin, who appeared last night on MSNBC.
There was clear evidence, though, that the political appointees inside VA were working against me and my leadership team because they felt that we were trying to strengthen the VA rather than move it towards privatization.
And then I wanted to turn to the man that President Trump is nominating to replace Dr. David Shulkin. Yes, Donald Trump has tapped White House physician Ronny Jackson to head the Department of Veterans Affairs. Dr. Jackson is a naval officer who served as White House physician under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, received some criticism for his enthusiastic report about Trump's physical condition after Trump's exam in January.
The president's overall health is excellent. His cardiac performance during his physical exam was very good. He continues to enjoy the significant long-term cardiac and overall health benefits that come from a lifetime of abstinence from tobacco and alcohol. All clinical data indicates that the president is currently very healthy and that he will remain so for the duration of his presidency.
The doctor was then questioned about Trump's diet of hamburgers and diet soda, and he said it's all in the genes. He's got good genes. Suzanne Gordon, talk about Dr. Ronny Jackson, the president's doctor, who he wants to make the head of this $200 billion agency, as you said, the second largest in government.
Well, the doctor has no administrative experience. He has very limited clinical experience. He was a combat military doctor in Iraq. He's familiar with military medicine, which is basically get him up, get him out quickly, get him in line, and get him fighting again. The VA medicine is entirely different. It's dealing with veterans with multiple complex chronic conditions. His medical experience is, as I said, in the White House with largely well-to-do people who probably eat right, with the exception of the president, and maybe get enough exercise and so on. But veterans, the Veterans Affairs, the Veterans Health Administration, which he will be administering, is dealing with older, sicker, poor veterans who bear no resemblance to the kind of patients one treats in the White House. I mean, basically Jackson is just a doctor. That's his qualification. He curried favor with Trump by minimizing Trump's weight-related and diet-related problems, but I think he'll be a puppet that will put the VHA and the VA on a starvation diet rather than putting the president on the much-needed diet that he should have been on a long time ago.
I want to turn to an ad from the Koch-backed Concerned Veterans for America, criticizing Wisconsin Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin and Veterans Affairs.
I worked at the Tacoma VA for 9 years. I was there as a staff nurse and was a vet getting care. They kept giving me meds, and at one point I was on 7 different medicines. Their idea of treating the vets is to throw more pills at them. The Tacoma VA were enabling these guys to become addicts. We know for a fact that Tammy Baldwin had these reports that showed bad things that were going on. Tammy Baldwin had all that information and did nothing with it. Vets were dying, vets were committing suicide. It was heartbreaking to see that. I want an answer.
Again, this ad from Concerned Veterans for America, not to be confused with the American Legion or Veterans for Foreign Wars. This is the Koch-backed organization that is pushing hard for privatization. Suzanne Gordon.
Well, the Koch brothers amplifies every tiny problem or significant problem in the VA to make it seem like it's a systemic problem. The problem of opiate use in Tacoma was a problem, yes, but it was a problem in one facility. The VA has been acting nationwide to help veterans get off opioid narcotics and manage pain with all kinds of integrative treatments. This is never reported in the media. It's not reported in the New York Times or USA Today or the Washington Post. And the opioid crisis is simplified. I mean, all over America, when the VA started prescribing opioids, there was a criticism of doctors for not treating pain more effectively. This was also pushed by Big Pharma. And yes, Tacoma was a problem, but it was a small problem in a large system that is doing a tremendous amount to try to deal with the horrible chronic pain problems that veterans leave the military with. No one talks talks about where these problems begin. It's not the VA that creates pain problems and the kind of PTSD that leads veterans to want to kill themselves. It's the military, and it's the wars that we electively get into, which put people in harm's way. And the VA is trying desperately to fix these problems, but not every single one of these problems is fixable because people are so damaged by war and sometimes even by the exposures and occupational injuries that they have in military service, and they don't even have to leave the country to have them.
Suzanne Gordon, talk about what a privatized VA looks like. In fact, the VA, Veterans Administration, is really socialized medicine. Is that right?
The VA is really the nation's only single-payer system. It treats everyone who is eligible. Not all of the 22 million veterans in this country are eligible. You have to have some sort of service-connected problem, PTSD, Agent Orange, diabetes. There's huge variety of them because being in the military is very dangerous, again, even without going into combat. And then you have to have income requirements. So the VA really cherry picks the oldest, sickest, and poorest veterans. There's no other healthcare system that has so many old, sick, poor veterans or patients. And the VA really functions as an integrated system to take care of all their problems. It integrates primary and mental health care. It has probably the best mental health system in the country because our mental health system in the private sector is a disgrace. It has the best geriatric care in the country. It has incredible end-of-life care. It has amazing rehabilitation services, blind rehabilitation centers, stroke centers, spinal cord injury centers. And these don't just treat veterans who have been in combat. I know a gentleman in Boston who was 78 years old. He was an MIT professor. He suffered a catastrophic injury, was quadriplegic. He was kicked out of the Mass General Hospital in Spalding Rehab and told to basically go home and he'd never walk again. They discovered he was a veteran. They sent him for 4 months of inpatient rehabilitation, a year and a half of other rehabilitation, and he is now walking a mile with a walker. This is the kind of thing our private sector system never does. If I have that kind of problem, God forbid, I will never get the kind of care that Samuel J. Kaiser got at the Boston VA. And this is true all over the country. The private sector system is just not ready to care for the kind of complex problems, multiple problems that veterans have. It is unprepared to do that.
You know, often what's raised when you talk about privatizing the VA, the issue of a vet who lives hundreds of miles away from one of the VA hospitals or clinics and wants to see a doctor, and the very reasonable need to work with maybe a local private doctor. But that's not what privatization of the VA is about. Talk about what it would look like. What are the Koch brothers' plans?
Well, they would like the VA to be like TRICARE, which is the military insurance program, an insurance provider that pays for care, not delivers care. And the VA has great health outcomes. And really, it's important for people to understand that in every single study, and they keep coming out day after day after day, every single scientific study shows that the VA in most areas is equal or superior to the care delivered at in the private sector for much lower costs. So if we were to privatize, veterans would lose integrated care. Now, it's true that many veterans who live in rural areas have to travel to get to a facility where they can have surgery. But this is true for anybody in a rural area. And when they've studied the problem of would veterans get more expeditious care if they lived in rural areas under privatization, they found that they probably wouldn't because there just aren't the doctors and specialists. I mean, Amy, if you look at the stats on mental health care in this country, 55% of American counties, all of them rural, have no psychiatrist, no psychologist, or no social worker. There is no excess capacity out there to take care of these veterans. In San Francisco during flu season, University of California, San Francisco Hospital had people stacked up in the ER waiting for 60 hours for a bed because there wasn't enough capacity. Imagine adding 100,000 veterans who now are cared for in veterans facilities to those people in those ERs in flu season. It would be a disaster. The whole idea of privatization is based on this myth that we have excess capacity. Now, what they really want is they don't want to take these hospitals and the Koch brothers and the hospital chains that are fighting for more veterans. They don't want people with chronic illnesses and mental health problems and primary care. They don't have enough people to take care of the patients that are already on their books. What they want is they want, to do the colonoscopy, the high-cost colonoscopy or the hip replacement. But why that would cost more money and veterans wouldn't get integrated care.
So do you think the firing of Shulkin is the beginning? Who knows if Dr. Jackson will be approved by the Senate? As one Republican lobbyist on Capitol Hill, when he heard, said the words Harriet Miers, a woman who didn't quite make it through a confirmation hearing. But because he has no experience in running a large organization, it's kind of like the word is that Trump wants to put his private pilot as head of the FAA.
Exactly.
It means that he's a blank slate on these issues and that he could be heavily influenced, as opposed to Shulkin, however much he was criticized for even going in any privatization direction. He saw himself as a bulwark against that privatization.
Ronny Jackson, under any other president, would never be considered for a position like Secretary of the VA. He will be, as one Veteran Service representative told me, the perfect puppet, because he will owe this job to the president. He has no experience, and he will probably do what the president and his very arch-conservative advisors, he will do their bidding because he owes his now elevated position if he's confirmed. I think it's up to the Senate and the veteran service organizations to oppose this, and it's up to them to oppose privatization. And Amy, the really frightening thing about all this is it's not just the Republicans. I mean, there are many Democrats in the House and in the Senate who really are not standing tall enough about the issue of opposing what I call stealth privatization. Outsource this, outsource that. And pretty soon you have nothing left. And Democrats have to really stand firm on this issue. John Tester of Montana is the co-sponsor of a bill that would really increase the pace of privatization. They claim it's not privatization, but it is creeping privatization. And we need people to say, no, fix the VA. There's 35,000 unfilled positions in the VA. There's need for more exam space and clinical space and infrastructure repair. We spent in the past 4 years or 3 years 49% more money on private sector care, and we gave the VA 9% more for its own clinical care. And we're sending veterans out into a private sector that is not ready to serve them. The RAND Corporation just did a study of New York State physicians and nurse practitioners and mental health providers, and it found that 2%, according to its criteria, 2% of providers in a state that serves the 5th largest population of veterans had the capacity and the readiness to serve and deal with veterans' problems. 2%.
Well, you talk about all those thousands of positions that haven't been filled at the VA. Now the top one is also open because President Trump has fired Dr. David Shulkin. Suzanne Gordon, I want to thank you for being with us, award-winning journalist and author. We'll link to your piece at American Prospects. Studies show private sector providers are not ready to care for veterans. Gordon is the author of The Battle for Veterans Healthcare, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Policymaking and Patient Care. When we come back, we'll speak with a resident physician at the VA in Nashville, not only about Dr. Shulkin's firing, but also about a former senator's comments. That's Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, recommending to the kids, rather than lobbying on Capitol Hill and fighting for gun control, why don't they do something worthwhile, he says, like learn CPR? Stay with us.
1, 2, I'm about to set this off like this. Hip-hoppers, check it. Another MC loses life tonight, Lord. I beg that you pray to Jesus Christ. Why? Oh Lord, Father, don't let him bury me. Whoa. I horn MCs like Mephistopheles, bringing swords of Damocles. Secret Service keep a close watch as if my name was Kennedy. Abstract rap, simple with this street format. Gaze into the sky and measure planets by parallax. Check out the retrograde motion, kill the notion of biting and recycling and calling it your own creation. I feel like Rockwell, somebody's watching me. I got no privacy, whether on land or at sea. And for your biting zealots, your raps are iconic. Hypocrite, predict, but deep inside you wish you had the pop hit. It hurts, don't it? A refugee come to you.
Zealots by the Fugees, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Doctors across the country are slamming former Republican Senator Rick Santorum for arguing that young people protesting for gun control would be better served by learning CPR.
How about kids, instead of looking to someone else to solve their problem, do something about maybe taking CPR classes?
That was former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum speaking on CNN Sunday. He accepted thousands of dollars from the NRA during his time in office. In 2011, during his failed presidential bid, he staged a photo op wearing an orange NRA hat and hunting pheasants with a shotgun. Medical professionals roundly refuted Santorum's suggestion that CPR could help save the life of someone shot by a military-style assault rifle. Among them, our guest, Dr. Eugene Gu of Vanderbilt University Medical Center, who tweeted, quote, "As a surgeon, I've operated on gunshot victims who've had bullets tear through their intestines, cut through their spinal cord, and pulverize their kidneys and liver. Rick Santorum telling kids to shut up and take CPR classes is simply unconscionable," Dr. Gu tweeted. Well, for more, we continue our conversation with Dr. Gu, who's joining us today from Los Angeles, so he works in Nashville. Dr. Gu, can you respond to former Senator Rick Santorum?
Yes, and thank you so much, Amy, for having me on your show. I think former Senator Santorum's comments were very reminiscent of, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, when she said to the starving peasants, "Let them eat cake." It was just simply unconscionable. First of all, CPR isn't necessarily helpful for victims of penetrating trauma. Oftentimes, there's a bleeding around the heart. We call that cardiac tamponade. Or there's a collapsed lung, a tension pneumothorax that could be causing a cardiac arrest. And doing chest compressions is, just counterproductive at that point. Many of these patients are bleeding, and that's the source of why they're in such distress, and doing CPR is just not going to help them. But his comments just really reminded me of a patient that came into the hospital when I was on call. There was a man who had multiple gunshot wounds to his abdomen, and when he came into the trauma bay, he was crashing. His blood pressure was very low. His heart rate was through the roof. We didn't even have enough time to get a CT scan and see what's going on. We rushed him immediately to the operating room as a level 1 trauma. And as we opened up his abdomen, there was this immediate rush of blood that just fell onto the floor. We packed all 4 quadrants of his abdomen to temporarily stop the bleeding. And when we examined each quadrant, I saw that his liver, there was a large laceration on the right side of his liver that was causing a lot of the bleeding, as well as his right kidney was completely shattered. So we had to spend a lot of time removing his entire kidney, taking out that section of the liver that was damaged. And then we turned our attention to the abdomen, where there was a bunch of stool and feces just contaminating the whole area because the bullets had just ripped through his small intestine and his large intestine. We had to remove a large amount of bowels and create an ostomy. An ostomy is essentially a bag that contains the fecal material on the outside of the abdomen. After we spent many hours in the operating room doing the best we can to repair all his injuries, we sent him to the intensive care unit, intubated and sedated. He was clinging on to life for about a week, and then he finally, unfortunately, passed away. And he was only 20 years old. And when I hear Rick Santorum telling these kids who are literally marching for their lives, protesting against the gun violence that happens, in their very schools, when he just tells them, don't do that, why don't you learn CPR instead, it outrages me, it outrages many other medical professionals as well. And it's, like I said, it's a simply unconscionable comment to make. These politicians are already not doing anything to help these children, but they are going out of their way to tell these children not to protest.
I also wanted to ask you, Dr. Gu, about what's happening at the Department of Veterans Affairs. On Wednesday, President Trump fired Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Dr. David Shulkin, said he'd replace him with his White House physician, Dr. Ronny Jackson, a Rear Admiral in the Navy. Dr. Jackson has no experience running a large agency. This is the second largest in government, $200 billion agency. Dr. Shulkin says he was ousted because of his opposition to privatizing the VA, which runs 1,700 hospitals and clinics. So this is President Trump at a rally in Ohio on Thursday.
I had passed the VA Accountability Act, and now when they're bad to our vets or when they're not working for our vets, we say, hey, Jim, you're fired. Get out of here, Jim. Get out.
We can only imagine he's just getting Dr. David Shulkin's name wrong as he talks about Jim. But Dr. Eugene Gu, you've worked at the local VA in Nashville as a resident physician for the last 2.5 years. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is a consequence of what it means to have elected a reality TV show guy who's not qualified to be president, who's now hiring all these people who are not qualified to be, the Secretary of Education like Betsy DeVos, or now the Secretary of the VA, Ronny Jackson. Earlier he had even tried to appoint his personal pilot to be, head of the FAA. And Ronny Jackson, who has absolutely no experience running a large federal agency, I think, earlier in your segment you talked about, you and Suzanne talked about how the VA is the second largest federal agency with a $200 billion budget. And Ronny Jackson has no experience running that. As a resident who has worked at the VA, I know the benefits of having a single provider, nationally integrated system in which to care for all of our veterans. When we have a veteran coming from Miami to Nashville, I can pull up all of his records because there's a standardized medical record system called CPRS where we can take a look at all of the veterans' imaging, all of the veterans' medical records. We don't have to call another hospital and figure out what procedures he had done. And it's very, very convenient and effective for us. If the veteran, these veterans have very specific injuries. Oftentimes we can have a young 20-year-old veteran who has hearing loss that you wouldn't expect to see in a 20-year-old because of all the, loud gunshots that he's been having to hear. And, we can consult an audiologist. We can have an ENT physician see him. Having an integrated system is extremely important and cost-efficient for these veterans. Sometimes, I've seen there's been a hybrid push to see what privatization looks like by having a VA choice system. This choice system is where if a veteran can't get the care he needs at our VA within 30 days, he can be choiced out or sent to another private hospital within the community. Now, what I've seen with that choice system is that it actually degrades the level of care we have at our VA. For example, at the Nashville VA, the sterilizers were broken for quite some time. The sterilizers we used to autoclave and sterilize the surgical instruments. So the operating rooms were actually at very limited capacity because we didn't have clean surgical tools to operate on our veterans, which is a travesty. But because of this quote-unquote choice system, which allows us to send veterans to other hospitals, it was almost like a crutch that we used to say, okay, we don't have to really have that much of an impetus to fix these broken sterilizers that are not cleaning the surgical tools we need. We can just choice these veterans out to other local private hospitals, and they can still get their surgeries. Well, I had one patient come in the middle of the night, who needed emergency surgery, but because our sterilizers weren't working, we didn't have clean tools to operate on him. We had to, choice him out or send him, to another hospital, and that delayed his care. And I think that that's just one example of what can happen with privatization of the VA. Another example is we saw the horrible response to the disaster relief in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria when FEMA tried to privatize disaster relief. They gave a $156 million contract to a one-woman company. I believe his name was Tiffany Brown. And she was contracted to provide 30 million meals to these starving Puerto Ricans who just suffered this major disaster. And, it turned out that she only provided 50,000 meals out of the 30 million that she was contracted to provide. So they paid all this money to this lady who then just pocketed the money for herself. And I think that
I wanted to ask you about another issue. You're one of 7 Twitter users who has filed a lawsuit against President Trump after being blocked from Trump's personal account. The case is titled Knight First Amendment Institute versus Trump. Very quickly, can you talk about what this is about?
Yeah, definitely. So one day I tweeted to Trump after he made a tweet about how he was doing so well in the Rasmussen poll. And I tweeted to him because recently at that time he made a comment about a typo called Covfefe, which many people didn't know what that was. And so I wrote in response, Covfefe, the man who controls our country's nuclear codes, doesn't proofread his Twitter account. He blocked me for that. And I think that, the President of the United States uses his personal Twitter account, to make actual national policy announcements. And for instance, he fired Secretary of State Rex Tillerson through his Twitter account. He fired the Secretary of the VA, David Shulkin, through his Twitter account. This is a very important information for me as an American citizen to see. And so it's not necessarily his personal Twitter account anymore if he is using it in his capacity as a president of the United States to announce major policy changes and personnel changes.
Finally, we just have 30 seconds, Dr. Gu, but you tweeted a photo of yourself taking a knee and raising a fist with the caption, "I'm an Asian American doctor, and today I take the knee to fight white supremacy." Dr. Gu, you were placed on paid administrative leave after the mother of one of your patients complained about that photo. Very quickly, your response.
Yeah, so I took the knee to fight white supremacy because when I was an intern general surgery resident at Vanderbilt, I was racially and physically attacked in the parking garage by a white supremacist. He stalked me all the way up 9 flights of stairs at the hospital, grabbed me by my name badge, nearly choking me. And so when I saw the NFL players like Colin Kaepernick and Michael Bennett taking the knee to fight police brutality and white supremacy, it resonated very much with me. And so wearing the same hospital white coat and scrubs that I had worn the day that I was racially and physically attacked, I took the knee to fight against the very racism that I was the victim of. It was a very personal thing for me to be attacked like that, and so I wanted to do a peaceful protest to fight what happened to me, and I was punished for it.
I want to thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Eugene Gu, general surgery resident at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee, healthcare columnist for The Hill. Dr. Gu's also worked at the local VA in Nashville as a resident physician for the last 2.5 years. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Stephen Hawking's funeral is tomorrow in Britain. We'll remember this remarkable, groundbreaking scientist. Stay with us. Hawking Radiation by Philip Glass, from the score to Errol Morris's film A Brief History of Time, based on Stephen Hawking's book of the same name. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. On Saturday, members of the scientific community, family, friends, fans alike will gather to remember the life and legacy of the groundbreaking physicist Stephen Hawking. Dr. Hawking died March 14th at his home in Cambridge, England, at the age of 76. For decades, he enchanted both scientists and science lovers by making groundbreaking discoveries about the origins of the universe, then translating these ideas for millions of non-scientists worldwide. His 1988 book, A Brief History of Time, From the Big Bang to Black Holes, has sold more than 10 million copies. His career and life itself have been celebrated as a medical miracle. Born in Oxford, Britain in 1942, he was diagnosed with a neuromuscular disorder known as Lou Gehrig's disease at the age of 21. Doctors said he had only a few years to live. Instead, he went on to live for more than half a century, traveling the world in his motorized wheelchair, communicating through a custom-made computerized voice synthesizer. His only complaint was that the synthesizer gave him an American accent. Dr. Hawking also protested against U.S. wars, including the U.S. war in Vietnam and the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Physics professor Michio Kaku of the City University of New York said, quote, "Not since Albert Einstein has a scientist so captured the public imagination and endeared himself to tens of millions of people around the world." This is Stephen Hawking speaking at the White House in 1998.
Yet if, as I hope, basic science becomes part of general awareness, what now appear as the paradoxes of quantum theory will seem as just common sense to our children's children. However, to a large extent, we shall have to rely on mathematical beauty and consistency to find the ultimate theory of everything.
That's physicist, professor, and best-selling author Stephen Hawking, speaking in 1998 at the White House. Despite Hawking's avowed atheism, his funeral Saturday is scheduled to be a traditional Church of England service. Well, for more, we're going to Savannah, Georgia, to speak with Stephen Hawking's biographer, Kitty Ferguson, the author of 2 books about Hawking, Stephen Hawking, An Unfettered Mind, and Stephen Hawking, Quest for a Theory of Everything. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Kitty Ferguson. Your thoughts on Stephen Hawking's passing, a man you have worked with for many years?
Well, we have for many years known that this could happen at any time. We've had him much longer than we ever expected to. Nevertheless, to hear that he had died was a shock. I think on my part, I thought, no, Stephen doesn't die. We always hear he might, but he doesn't. And my feeling is that the world is just an oddly empty place without him. And I'm so sad to lose him, really.
So you worked with him on your biographies of him. He reviewed the scientific aspects of what you wrote?
Yes, initially, excuse me, he gave me a lot of material, pictures of his childhood and his own recollections that he'd written out about when he first discovered he had his disease. And he sent me off and, said, go ahead and write it. And I did. And then I brought back, he didn't ask to see the paragraphs about his life. He asked to see the scientific paragraphs, the scientific pages. And so we sat there in his office and he read them and I turned the pages for him so he could read them. And he approved of all of those. And then when he wrote his book, The Universe in a Nutshell, I was asked to come in and help him make it simpler, more understandable to what he calls ordinary people. That's like you and I, or anyone who isn't a theoretical physicist. So at that time also, I sat in his office. I remember so clearly the 2 screens in front of us, one with his communication system and the other with the book, with the manuscript of his book. Kitty. And we would scroll down and I would say, Stephen, I think that passage is too difficult. You've got to make that simpler.
Last year.
And his reply was, it seems perfectly clear to me. And of course, I thought, oh dear, this is going to be a problem. But then I looked over at him and I saw his wonderful smile and knew that he was having me on. And that was a smile that I had described as a smile that would light the universe.
Last year,
and sadly, in the last few months of his life, perhaps years, last few months really, He could no longer smile like that. Only his eyes could smile. The eyes could smile to light the universe, but not the whole face. And this is sad, and it is sad to lose him.
Last year, Stephen Hawking said that President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Change Agreement will cause avoidable environmental damage. This is Hawking speaking to the BBC ahead of a birthday conference in Cambridge, which was organized to mark his 75th birthday.
We are close to the tipping point where global warming becomes irreversible. Trump's action could push the Earth over the brink to become like Venus, with a temperature of 250 degrees and raining sulfuric acid. Climate change is one of the great dangers we face, and it's one we can prevent if we act now. By denying the evidence for climate change and pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, Donald Trump will cause avoidable environmental damage to our beautiful planet, endangering the natural world for us and our children.
Dr. Hawking took a number of scientific and political stands in 2013, stirred up quite a bit of controversy when he joined the academic boycott against Israel. Can you explain his position there, Kitty Ferguson?
Well, he had been in Israel previous to this. I don't have the dates at hand exactly, but his last visit there, he had asked to also speak to a Palestinian audience, which he did. And then the next time he was invited to go, his first reaction was, good, this will give me another chance to speak out for the Palestinians. But then colleagues, and I think some of his Palestinian physicist friends, said a boycott would probably be more effective. And that, at that point, he decided not to attend any more conferences there. As far as I know, he's turned down 2 invitations, maybe more, coming from the president of Israel. So that's, this has been a very strong cause for him. I have to say that he's been accused of boycotting things in Israel and not boycotting things in other countries that also have civil rights problems, such as China. I have to say I've never in all my years detected anything anti-Semitic about him. So I think any kind of accusations on those grounds are unfounded. I personally wouldn't write about anybody who was vocally anti-Semitic.
Can you talk about how he dealt with his motor neuron disease, how he dealt with Lou Gehrig's disease, and really normalize living with difficulties like this, enormous physical challenges for so many people around the world?
Well, first of all, the first time I met him, when I went into his office and met him for the first time, and that was when I was proposing to write my first book about him, I was shocked. He just seemed so much worse off than I'd ever been led to expect, even than pictures had led me to expect. And the slowness of his communication seemed so frustrating, but I soon realized this is his way of communicating. He is not frustrated by it. This is his way of dealing with things, and I've got to learn to accept it that way, too. But I think one important point that's been brought out by many other similarly or nearly as similarly handicapped people since his death, really, is that it's not quite right to talk about his doing all he did in spite of his illness. Partly he did it because of his illness. And if you read some of his writing about the time when he was just beginning to deal with it, he says himself, everything I have done since then, I would probably not have done had I not had this illness. Now, that's very interesting. We can't really know that that's so, that he would not have done it. But he was sort of at sea at that time. He wasn't focused, and the illness and his marriage to Jane Wilde focused him in a way that, could we have expected that otherwise?
Kitty Ferguson, we want to thank you for being with us. We're going to do part 2 of this discussion. There's so much to talk about in the life of Stephen Hawking, and we'll post it online at democracynow.org. Kitty Ferguson, the author of 2 biographies of Stephen Hawking, including Stephen Hawking, An Unfettered Mind, and Stephen Hawking, Quest for a Theory of Everything. Stephen Hawking will be remembered tomorrow at his funeral in Britain. A very happy birthday to Mike Burke, but we have this breaking news right now out of Gaza. The Palestinian Health Ministry says at least 5 people have been killed by Israeli soldiers and some 350 others injured, many of them by live bullets. The deaths come as Gaza residents built a tent city near the wall as part of a planned 6-week-long protest kicking off today, which is known as Land Day. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burker, Nate Feldstein, Guzder, Nermin Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.